opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Productivity Commission has found that the government's intervention in the housing sector delivers a windfall gain for banks. Up to half of this gain is paid for by taxpayers, as interest on investment loans is tax deductible. Therefore, Prime Minister, by refusing to reform negative gearing, isn't the government giving banks an annual bonus of $500 million of taxpayers' money? When will the Prime Minister put people ahead of the big banks?
Yeah.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Parliament has just passed the Banking Executive Accountability Regime, which is holding banking executives to account, an initiative of this government, and if Labor never did it, and of course we've opposed a major bank levy, which has made an important contribution to bringing the budget back into balance. But let me start, Mr Speaker, with what the honourable member said about negative gearing. Now, when they first proposed their utterly unfair and discriminatory proposed ban on people earning wages or salaries or professional income from offsetting that against net rental or business losses, when they proposed that, they said this was all about bringing down the price of housing, which is too high. That's what they said it was all about. Now they say it wouldn't affect the price of housing at all. So, he says, no, they don't. They do. They do. They only 1%, I think they said. Barely a ripple they're proposing. Mr Speaker, what the Labor Party is proposing in its ban on negative gearing is the most ill-thought-out tax grab you can imagine. Now, for our part, we have no doubt that it would hit the housing market with a sledgehammer with very, very negative consequences. But let's leave opinions on the value of real estate to one side. Let's look at how Labor discriminates against the very people they claim to represent. More than 2/3 of the people who file negative gearing claims are middle-income Australians. Nurses, teachers, policemen, and you can hear the Labor Party sneering about them, scoffing and scorning. That is where most of the negative gearing claims are laid. And who, under Labor's plan, will be able to continue to offset net rental losses, net business losses? Who will be able to continue negative gearing? Not the wage earner, not the salary earner, not the professional person, no policemen, no teachers. Who will be doing it? Wealthy people with large investment incomes. So the very people Labor claims to champion, they are abandoning, and the people they claim to be taking on are the ones that will benefit from the market, benefit from the greater opportunities afforded by yet another ill-fought Labor policy. They're such hopeless generals they can't even manage a class war.
The Prime Minister time has concluded. The member for McEwen will find it hard to stay in the chamber if he keeps interjecting. I refer him to his several warnings yesterday. The member for Chisholm has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House as to how the government's economic plan is creating jobs for hard-working Australians, including those in my electorate of Chisholm? Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question. And she's proud to be part of a government that is providing the economic leadership utterly lacking from members opposite and so necessary to ensure Australians have the opportunities they deserve now and in the future. We are growing the economy and creating jobs. 403,000 jobs last year, the largest jobs growth in any year on record. And that strong economy enables us to fund all of the services that Australians need, whether it is education, whether it is health, whether it is infrastructure or national security. Now, Mr Speaker, lower business taxes are vitally important to maintain this momentum. We want to drive investment further, create more jobs and more better paid jobs. Now, Planet Innovation, Mr Speaker, is an advanced medical device manufacturer in the honourable member's electorate. It's created more than 100 jobs in the last 18 months by tripling its exports. And they now want to use or take advantage of the lower business taxes we've delivered to increase investment, expand exports further and create more jobs. And their experience is matched by thousands of firms around the nation. That's what our business tax cuts for small and medium businesses are delivering: investment, more jobs, more economic growth. Now, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition announced at a dinner with the BCA recently that he was going to take them on. He was declaring war on business. Well, we've just seen my previous answer how jumbled his efforts are, but his motives definitely are to take on business. He's not just holding business back. He is going to destroy jobs. Look at what they're doing with water right now. Labor is going to vote with the Greens to withdraw their support for the Basin Plan, a once bipartisan plan of which the member for Watson was a great supporter. Mr Speaker, when we lost government in 2007, the water responsibility went from me over to the Labor Party, first Senator Wong, then the member for Watson, and he became a great supporter of the Basin Plan. And now, the outcome of the Northern Basin Review that he initiated, he is now going to vote down in the Senate and destroy immediately hundreds and subsequently thousands of jobs. He's going to create financial and investment uncertainty and threaten jobs right across the basin. And of course, it's not just there. Right across the country. What about their war on the Galilee Basin? Labor has abandoned the people they claim to represent. They've abandoned the workers of Australia.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for McMahon has the
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. The Productivity Commission has found that the government's interventions into the housing sector deliver a windfall gain for the banks, and that up to half of this gain is paid for by taxpayers because of negative gearing. Why should Australians, including young Australians struggling to buy their first home, pay for an annual bonus of $500 million to the banks because this government refuses to reform negative gearing?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for the question. He perhaps should have given it to the member for Lilly, because this is what the member for Lilly said about negative gearing, Mr Speaker, and he was asked by John Pyne. John Pyne, my good friend, our good friend John Pyne, he said this. He said, "Why not adopt the measure to quarantine negative gearing losses offset against income just from that investment?" Treasurer Swan, that's the transcript. "Well, I've never accepted that view, and I think it would be disastrous in the current environment, politically disastrous or economically disastrous," Mr Pyne said. Treasurer Swan said this: "No, economically disastrous to do anything on negative gearing, and indeed that's what the Henry Review says, Mr Speaker." See, the problem with the Labor Party is they can never hold to one position on the economy at any time. They're saying it was 9 years ago. Apparently housing affordability wasn't a problem 9 years ago, Mr Speaker. Well, I can tell you anyone who's sought to buy a house in Sydney in the last 50 years has known something about housing affordability. And Labor Party have held out this measure as something of a panacea. And this government took action through the regulator over several years, but particularly last year, and that saw the growth in house prices in Sydney decelerate from 17% to 1%. That's the approach we took. That's the approach we took. The approach proposed by the Shadow Treasurer is now, on top of that, to bring about negative gearing's abolition, but not only that, to increase capital gains tax by 50%. And he wants to do that on a house price now only growing in Sydney at 1%. How far does the Shadow Treasurer want property prices of mum and dad's homes to fall in this country as a result of their reckless policies? But it goes further. He knows that his capital gains tax policy doesn't just apply to housing. They are going to increase the capital gains tax by 50% on retail shops, on factories and on share transactions. On a time like this, when superannuants are worried about the impact of global share markets, the Labor Party is out there saying, I want to whack up a big fat tax on people's share earnings. Now, he bleats and he blusters. All I know about this Shadow Treasurer and this Leader of the Opposition is they couldn't find an economic compass between them.
The member for Wide Bay has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on why it's important for the government to deliver on its economic plan to drive growth and generate more jobs for hard-working Australians? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Wide Bay for his question and his support, as there is the support of all members of this side of the House for the government's strong plan to grow our economy, for jobs and growth. We have a plan for jobs and growth, and we're sticking to it, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, because we know how important it is to stick to strong plans that deliver on the ground for Australians, and our plan for growing jobs and growth in this country is working. The results are there, Mr Speaker. Over 400,000 jobs last year, 1,100 jobs a day, the lowest level of welfare dependency for the working-age population in this country in 25 years, and there's more to do, and this government has a plan to get on and do it. As I just reminded the House then, Mr Speaker, Labor have lost their economic compass. They cannot find their way around the economy. They used to believe things. The Shadow Treasurer once famously said it was a Labor thing to reduce company tax because it promotes investment, creates jobs and drives growth. Yet when we ask him to vote for it, he evaporates. His economic credibility simply evaporates. Labor are running out of excuses, Mr Speaker, for their opposition to the government's plan to reduce the tax burden on business. We had the member for Rankin who went out there and he said the Trump tax cuts, they have nothing to do with lifting growth in the economy. Only hours later, the IMF comes out, puts up their global growth forecast, world forecast for growth on the back of the Trump tax cuts, Mr Speaker. Then on top of that, the Shadow Treasurer says, oh, we can't afford it. So why did the Shadow Treasurer say back in 2013, when he said we currently can't afford it, he praised the UK government, and I quote, for reducing company taxes to 21% when the United Kingdom faced a much tougher fiscal situation, Mr Speaker. We had the Leader of the Opposition say that in 2011 cutting the company tax rate is an important step. The deficit he had at that time in government was $41 billion and rising, Mr Speaker. They say it's unaffordable. They say, the Shadow Treasurer, that we can't have company tax cuts and retain our AAA credit rating. Well, S&P hit that out of the park when they confirmed our AAA credit rating with a budget that included our company tax cuts, Mr Speaker. The Shadow Treasurer's economic compass cannot find any true north, Mr Speaker, because when you believe in nothing, no one will believe in you.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister rule out abandoning the 4 pillars policy, which would allow the big 4 banks to merge and get even bigger and more powerful?
The Prime Minister has the call. Members on my right will cease interjecting.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The 4 pillars policy has been part of Australian governments of both sides, financial sector policy for many years, and I expect it will remain so for many years. And I can assure you we have no intention of contemplating mergers between the big 4 banks.
The member for Indi.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is the Minister for Defence Industry. Minister, I really welcome your announcement that Defence is entering negotiations with Thales Australia for the continued operations of the factory in Benalla and Mulwala. This provides certainty to the 640 workers at Thales and a supply chain of 130 small to medium enterprises. Minister, will you please commit to continuing support to the growth of existing defence industry in Indi, including the BAE Systems bid for Land 400?
The Minister for Defence Industry has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would say at the outset it's a nice try from the member for Indi to get me to talk about a tender which is close to completion for the Land 400 project, which is the combat reconnaissance vehicle project worth about $4 to $5 billion of value to the Australian economy over time. But I will avoid breaking the tender, particularly at this late stage. But in terms of the very good announcement that we've made in the last 24 hours about the munitions factories at Benalla and Mulwala, I'm sure that the member for Farrer would also have liked the opportunity to ask this question as well, because Benalla and Mulwala, of course, cross the electorates of Indi and Farrer. It is a very important announcement. It secures 640 jobs for people in regional Victoria and New South Wales. As you said in your question, 130 businesses across the supply chain, and it is a success story in defence industry, because many years ago the munitions factories were looking down the barrel, quite frankly, pardon the pun, because of the ancient nature of some of their facilities. But we've invested in the manufacturing facilities in your electorate and in the member for Farrer's electorates, and now the munitions factories there are the most modern in the world. They are about 1,050 hectares. They create propellants and explosives which they export now to 17 different countries around the world, as well as providing the Australian defence requirements. They are a success story. And rather than waiting until 2019-20 to start negotiations with Thales Australia for the next 5-year contract, or however long that contract might be, we wanted to give certainty to the families, the highly skilled workers in Benalla and Mulwala to make decisions about their future, so they'd be able to make their own decisions about the future for themselves and their families, Mr Speaker. So it is very good. What it also indicates, of course, is that the government's $200 billion investment in the military capability of our defence forces is really starting to pay significant dividends. We need to have our own sovereign capabilities in terms of propellants and explosives. We want to see that being able to be exported to our friends and allies around the world. So the defence industry policy of the government, working with the defence export strategy, which the Prime Minister and I announced late in January of this year, is starting to see the dividends for workers, for businesses on the ground. So it is a good news for both of the electorates, Farrer and for Indi. I wish the negotiations the very best, and I'm sure they'll end up ensuring that those jobs will stay in place in the future, and the highly technical, sophisticated workers that have their livelihoods from the defence industry will continue to do so.
Just before I call the member for Dawson, I'd like to inform the House that we've just had join us in the chamber this afternoon the Right Honourable Trevor Mallard, Speaker of the New Zealand Parliament, and His Excellency Mr Chris Seed, the New Zealand High Commissioner. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you both. The member for Dawson.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how the government's investment of $75 billion in infrastructure for regional and metropolitan Australia is driving job opportunities for hard-working Australians? Is he aware of any threats to those job opportunities across Australia?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and note his advocacy not only for infrastructure projects in the seat of Dawson, but also for such things as the sugar code and the cane industry. And it's obviously of great import that we see the investment that's happening in the seat of Dawson. Mackay Ring Road Stage 1, close to $500 million in that, and 534 jobs. The pavement widening from Bowen to St Lawrence, another $12 million, or the Horton River floodplain upgrade, which we're currently discussing with the member for Dawson, which is well in excess of $500 million. the Van Tassel Street to Cluden Street duplication, the Sandy Gully Bridge upgrade, the Yellow Gin Creek Bridge upgrade, the Sandy Corner and Collinson's Lagoon realignment and raising, close to $1.3 billion worth of capital investment in the seat of Dawson. And I'd like to acknowledge the hard work that the member for Dawson has done in bringing about more than 1,700 jobs to his area in this Bruce Highway upgrade. Of course, the Bruce Highway upgrade in itself is a multiple billion-dollar investment in our nation. About $8.5 billion will be the total cost. And it goes towards a vision for this nation that goes beyond the seat of Dawson, in our vision to have a sealed road for the capacity of the traffic that travels along it from the top of Cape York to the bottom of Victoria. And this is more than just a pipe dream. On the Peninsula Development Road, we've sealed close to 400 kilometres of that 600-kilometre route. And we acknowledge that there is still a further in excess of 400 kilometres of dirt road that goes north from Weipa. And we also see the Midland Highway in Tasmania, the work that we are doing there. This is a government with a vision for our nation, because we know with good infrastructure comes jobs, comes development of our nation. Likewise, we have a vision that goes from the north-east to the south-west with such things as the upgrade of the Outback Way, in which, with the combination of beef roads and the $100 million investment in the section between Laverton and Winton, we can have the capacity of a sealed road that goes from Cairns down to Perth. This gives us the capabilities in the future to further open up the mineral precincts around Laverton, and also to create an intermodal hub at Alice Springs, bringing further economic growth to that. Well, I think it is incredibly important that this nation has a vision for these forms of infrastructure projects. It's imperative, if we are to develop this nation away from its crescent form that goes from Brisbane round to Adelaide, that we have the infrastructure projects such as the upgrade of the Bruce Highway, such as the upgrade of the Pacific Highway, such as the Outback Way connecting Winton to Laverton, creating the third sealed road across our nation, such as the Inland Rail. That is the form of infrastructure that takes our nation to a higher level.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. Last year, company profits increased by 20%, but average wages for Australians only rose by 2%. At a time when workers are not getting their fair share, how can the Prime Minister possibly expect Australians to believe that a Trump-style $65 billion tax giveaway will trickle down to the pay packets of millions of ordinary Aussie workers?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. And of course, Mr Speaker, this once upon a time powerful advocate for company tax cuts, driving investment, productivity and higher wages, this Leader of the Opposition now says that the proposition that lower business taxes result in more investment, more employment and higher wages is a fairy tale. A fairy tale, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, it's always good to look out for fairy tales, and I wouldn't have thought the Leader of the Opposition, he's quite capable, obviously we see it all the time, of doing a 180 degrees on his own views, but what about the 2010 budget, written by the members for Lilly, and of course ably assisted by the member for Rankin. I reckon the member for Rankin wrote this bit. He said the reduction in the company tax rate is expected to increase GDP by 0.4% in the long run. This will, together with resource tax reforms, this will lead to a long-run increase in GDP of around 0.7% and increase real after-tax wages by 1.1%. Over time, this will lead to an increase in investment. This, in turn, will flow through to higher real wages for Australians. Now, Mr Speaker, this 2010 budget overview, which has now been, that part has been now been dismissed as a fairy tale by the Leader of the Opposition. I have to say, to be fair to the Leader of the Opposition, that the document is not entirely without fairy tale content.
The member for Bendigo.
I'm referring
cease
particularly to page 4 of the 2010 budget summary, which says returning to surplus 3 years early. Back to surplus before every major advanced economy.
Crowning achievements,
So, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has missed the real fairy tale, and the real fairy tale is there and everywhere, and that is that the Labor Party is capable of economic management.
The member for Griffith is now warned. We're on track for the next step. She continues to interject. The member for Canning has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the minister update the House on action the government is taking to make Australia more competitive in the global economy? How does this compare to the actions of other countries?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Canning for his question and for his powerful advocacy for more jobs in his electorate. Mr. Speaker, Australia is an export-oriented market economy. We're dependent on trade and investment for economic growth and more jobs. And to ensure that our companies and businesses can remain competitive, the Turnbull government is proposing to cut corporate tax rates alongside what is happening globally, and it's instructive to see what comparable economies are doing. Last year I was in Dublin and I was told constantly about the huge economic resurgence in Ireland as a result of cutting their corporate tax rate to 12.5%. Last month I was in the United States and business leaders spoke about the surge in business confidence and the new jobs as a result of the Trump administration's announcement that corporate tax rates will be cut to 21%. In the United Kingdom, the government is aiming for a corporate tax cut of 17%, a rate of 17%. Across Europe, they are cutting their corporate tax rates, for example, in France and Belgium. So, Mr. Speaker, our competitors, our trading partners are cutting corporate tax rates, and if we do not act, Australia will have the second highest corporate tax rate in the OECD. And these other nations, our competitors, are cutting corporate tax rates because they know it leads to more investment and more jobs. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Turnbull government has announced that we will aim to reduce our corporate tax rate to 25%, and that was the policy of the Labor Party. I'm reminded that on the 22nd of September 2015, the Shadow Treasurer said that Labor accepts company tax hurts workers most, that Labor accepts that company tax falls hardest on workers and aims for a 25% company tax rate to spur economic growth. That was the view of the Shadow Treasurer expressing Labor's economic plans. But today, to listen to the Leader of the Opposition and his captain's pick for the seat of Batman talking about their economic plan of opposing corporate tax cuts, of re-regulating the labour market, of considering nationalising the electricity grid, of attacking private sectors, you have to believe that the Leader of the Opposition is now inspired by the populist socialism of Venezuela. What we're hearing from the Leader of the Opposition is more Hugo Chavez and far less Bob Hawke and Paul Keating.
The Leader of the Opposition has the call. Members on my left, the member for Jellybrand, the Leader of the Opposition has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Productivity Commission has found that the government's intervention in the housing sector through APRA have, and I quote, led to a windfall gain for the banking sector. Up to half of this gain is in effect being paid for by taxpayers as interest on investment loans is tax deductible. The Commission estimates the cost borne by taxpayers as a result was up to $500 million a year. Does the Prime Minister agree or disagree?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I don't agree. I don't agree. No, I don't agree. And I'd be very happy for the Shadow Treasurer, given he's so interested in Treasury briefings, to have a briefing on this from Treasury, if you would like. I can make my own assessment of these things, Mr Speaker, as I do, and it's for this simple reason. The Productivity Commission's report does not provide a costing on this at all, as the Shadow Treasurer and the Leader of the Opposition should know. The Productivity Commission's report does not take into account the fact that price growth in housing, say in Sydney, has fallen from 17% to 1%, Mr Speaker, and as a result, those interest-only loans under a higher price growth environment means they would have borrowed a lot more, Mr Speaker. So they don't take into account the substitution effects, they don't take into account the behavioural effects. If what they're saying is true, Mr Speaker, then every time the Reserve Bank either decides to lift or lower cash rates, that is somehow a tax to the cost payer, either up or down, Mr Speaker. If the government had not taken the action through the regulator to ensure that we dealt with the heated investor activity, particularly in the Sydney and Melbourne markets, in the way that we did, and that is being opposed by the opposition, the Reserve Bank would have had greater pressure on it to actually lift the cash rate. So the Labor Party is saying no. What you should have done is you should have allowed the pressure to fall on the Reserve Bank to deal with problems in the Sydney and Melbourne housing markets by putting up the cash rate on the entire economy. The Shadow Treasurer is economically illiterate, Mr Speaker. He has no understanding of the operations of property markets or any other markets, Mr Speaker. He may once have believed these things, Mr Speaker. He may once have understood them, but the economic re-education program that he's been put through by the Leader of the Opposition means he has abandoned all of these things, Mr Speaker. But it's going to catch up to them. Because, you know, when you go around telling your audience what they want to hear in too many places, it ends up catching up with you. We're going to see that in the Batman by-election, Mr Speaker. All the things. I look forward to the Leader of the Opposition attending the Border Protection debates down there in Batman, Mr Speaker. I look forward to him thumping the table and telling them how tough he is on the borders, Mr Speaker, down there in Batman.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Treasurer has strayed off the topic of the question.
I confess I did, Mr Speaker, but the Leader of the Opposition has strayed off the topic of the economy for his entire time in the job.
Just before I call the member for Leichhardt, I'd like to inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon Mrs Natasha Griggs, the former member for Solomon. On behalf of the House, a warm welcome to you, and I call the member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister outline to the House the benefits of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and what this agreement means to the nation's economic growth and the creation of jobs for hard-working Australians? And is the Minister aware of any risks to these benefits?
The Minister for Trade and Investment.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Leichhardt for his ongoing interest in the TPP-11 and what this government's been able to achieve in terms of the trade deals. His interest builds on the interest of many members on this side, in fact all members on this side, who are all committed to opening up export markets for Australia and making sure as a direct consequence we drive economic growth and, importantly, we drive jobs, Mr Speaker. In fact, the member for Leichhardt can be justifiably proud of some outstanding examples of export success from his electorate. For example, crocodile leather from the member for Leichhardt's electorate is used to create Hermes bags, iconic bags. And, Mr Speaker, it goes to speak to the fact that Australian exporters, there'd be quite a lot on your side with Hermes bags, make no mistake about that. But the fact goes, Mr Speaker, that Australian exporters are stepping up to the plate in global value chains and making sure that they're at the forefront. And that's part of the reason why, as a government, we are so steadfastly committed to opening up trade export opportunities. But it's not just our word that people can take for granted. It's the fact that, for example, the CEO of the National Farmers Federation, Tony Maha, said of the TPP-11, it has great potential to drive job-creating growth across the Australian economy. And this is a sentiment that we're hearing right around the country. The Minerals Council of Australia said of the TPP-11 it will help ease the cost of living pressures on Australian consumers. because that's what this government stands for, creating economic growth, driving jobs and easing the cost of living pressures for Australian families. And we will continue to deliver on that. Now, over the last 2 days, I've spoken about how the Australian Labor Party stands in the way of good trade deals. We know they get the big calls wrong on trade. The Leader of the Opposition, the Shadow Trade Minister, both of them said that TPP-11 was dead. We heard Jed Carney, Labor's candidate in Batman, making comment like some kind of rabid green about how the TPP-11 was going to be bad. But the fact is, the anti-trade rhetoric from the Australian Labor Party is endemic. Just in January of this year, we heard, and I'll quote, they said, "The Turnbull government's latest Trans-Pacific trade deal will bring us closer to having the status of a third world economy." Now, this is the comment from the president of the AMWU and the former president of the Queensland Labor Party. The fact is, Mr Speaker, that Labor's loony left anti-trade rhetoric isn't just confined to winning a by-election. It runs deep in the veins of the Australian Labor Party. It's the reason why they field loony left candidates like Jed Carney. It's the reason they get the big calls wrong on trade. And it's the reason why the Australian people know that they can't trust this Leader of the Opposition or Labor to get the trade calls right, because Labor won't.
The member for Lawler.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that this Conservative government has delivered the worst pay conditions for working Australians since record began? When Australians are already suffering from the worst pay conditions on record, why does this Prime Minister have legislation in the Senate right now to increase the tax on someone earning $60,000 by $300 every year?
Members on my right, the Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I gather the honourable member wants to know why we have legislation in the Senate to increase the Medicare levy, and the answer is to pay for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Remember that? The reason we're doing that is because the Labor Party did not fund it. That's the reason we're doing it. We're doing it because the parents of disabled children who are concerned whether there will be the money in place to pay for their children's care after they're gone. We're doing it so that they will know that the money is there, the funding is secure and the NDIS is guaranteed. Labor's approach to the NDIS has been fraudulent. They have claimed some kind of moral high ground for supporting it and then failed to pay for it, and then failed recklessly to pay for it. They have mocked the families of disabled children. They have mocked them by seeking to elicit their praise and thanks for a disability insurance scheme they wouldn't pay for. The Labor Party should stop its hypocrisy and it should get behind that legislation and pay for that great, compassionate national enterprise.
The member for Tangney has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the importance of maintaining a national consistent approach to border protection policy? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question, acknowledge the great work that he's doing in his electorate, and this is a very important issue not only to Western Australians but to all Australians. And most Australians would realise that you can't have a state-by-state approach to national border protection policy. That would be a disaster, and we know the last time that there was a disaster in the border protection policy, it was presided over by Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, and then Kevin Rudd again, and the Leader of the Opposition sat around the cabinet table in each of those administrations, and he presided over 50,000 people coming on 800 boats and 1,200 people tragically drowning at sea. But it seems that they haven't learnt their lesson, because the Labor Party now is proposing a Melbourne version of Operation Sovereign Borders and a Brisbane version of Operation Sovereign Borders. The thing is that there is a national press gallery. We see them up here today and acknowledge their presence, thank them for the work that they do. They're going to hear the messages from the Leader of the Opposition in Melbourne And it's going to be a very different message than the message of the Leader of the Opposition speaking in Longman. So if you're in Bribie Island, or if you're in Wamuran, or if you're in Caboolture, you would be very angry to hear the Leader of the Opposition saying one thing in Victoria but the complete opposite in Queensland. Now, I'm not sure how the Leader of the Opposition is going to reconcile this, but I know how those up in Indonesia and Vietnam and the people smugglers elsewhere across the region will interpret it. They will hear the message, as they did the confused message from the Leader of the Opposition at Christmas time when he said you could just usher these people into New Zealand without consequences. The people smugglers will hear a divided message from Labor again, and they will see through the weakness of this Leader of the Opposition as they saw through the weakness and the duplicity of Labor leaders past. The reality is, Mr Speaker, you need to have a strong and united position, a national position, in relation to staring down the scourge of people smugglers. We have not had a death at sea for over 3 years because of the success of Operation Sovereign Borders, and we aren't going to start now. We've not got children in detention. We got 8,000 children out of detention, put into detention by Labor, and we aren't going to allow the boats to recommence and see those children go back into detention. So when the duplicity starts, when you hear this Leader of the Opposition speaking out of one side of the mouth in Victoria and the other side of his mouth when he's up in Caboolture or Bribie Island or Wamuran, see through his lies. See through what he's saying, Mr Speaker. The Australian public get it when they look at this Leader of the Opposition. They know that he's shady. They know that he's not straight up and down. They know that he doesn't speak the truth. The Australian public worked it out with Rudd and Gillard, and they are getting from this Leader of the Opposition exactly the same vibe.
The member for JAGAJAGA.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. How many people will be worse off under this Conservative government's plan to axe the bereavement allowance to grieving widows and other vulnerable Australians?
The Minister for Social Services has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for her question. And it's funny because yesterday— no, it is funny, because yesterday
Members on
we
my
had
left.
a similar line of questioning. We had a similar line of questioning, and halfway through question time, the member ran out, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. She must be going to put out a press release. So when I got out of question time, I said to my office, has the shadow member put out a press release? And they had a quick look. They couldn't find anything. And I said, I'm sure that'd be the tactic she'd use. So I said, have a look again. And they said, oh, yeah, there is something there. It's been done with the Shadow Treasurer. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So what does it say? Oh, it says the L-plate. It referred to the L-plate minister. I'll get to your answer.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Mr Speaker, unsurprisingly, the point of order is on direct relevance. There was no preamble to this question. It's very specific about how many people will be affected by the government's plans on the bereavement allowance. And at this moment, he's not yet been relevant to that in any way.
I thank the manager. I would ask the member for JAGAJAGA not to interject. I'm listening to the Manager of Opposition Business. I thank him for his point of order. I do have to say to the minister, having looked at the clock, whilst I allow preambles, we're more than a third of the way through the question. The preamble needs to come to a conclusion, and he needs to bring himself to the question that was asked.
No, I wasn't referring to the widows. No,
members on my left.
I wasn't referring to the widows. I was referring to the Shadow Minister, and if you will stop interjecting,
members on my
I'll
left.
get to the point. Right, I'll get to the point.
Minister will resume his seat. Members on my left will cease interjecting. I've asked the minister to bring himself to the question. I call the minister. The minister has the call. The minister has the call.
Not phoning a friend, as the opposition leader has said. I don't, No, I'm not. Keep going, mate. Keep going. Keep interjecting. Keep it coming.
Members on my left, the Leader of the Opposition and members on my left will cease interjecting. The minister has the call.
I was going to say that the Shadow Minister has the issue when she says and refers to an L-plate minister. Well, what I'd say to the Shadow Minister is I don't want you in the car with me while I'm learning to drive.
The minister will resume his seat. We're going to the next question. The member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Minister, can you update the House on action the Coalition Government is taking to deliver the Murray-Darling Basin Plan? And Minister, are you aware of any alternative approaches which threaten the delivery of the plan and which will place jobs that it helps to underpin in jeopardy?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the honourable member for his question, because he knows full well the importance of delivering this plan on time and in full. Sadly, Mr Speaker, I have to advise the House that the Basin Plan never before has been so fragile as it is today. Yesterday, the member for Watson advised me that he will join the Greens in disallowing the Northern Basin Review. This will put at jeopardy the full plan in implementing the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, a plan that the member for Watson created. The Northern Basin Review was created by the member for Watson. The outcomes of that Northern Basin Review have been in the public domain since November 2016. Yet, at 5 to midnight, he decides to say that there needs to be more work done to the Northern Basin Review, some 14 months after it was outlined. I don't buy it. This is more about politics rather than leadership. Those of us that have been honoured to be elected to this place wonder sometimes why there is a political discord across this nation, why this nation doesn't trust its elected leaders. It's times like this where people put politics ahead of leadership, real leadership that is required to deliver this plan. These are real people's lives that we are playing with, people's lives that I've known, and I've sat and listened to them, like the farmers, the hardened men that I've respected, that are better men than me and the member for Watson, that sat there with the fear and the tears in their eyes about the uncertainty for their family, about their future and what they're able to achieve in their life. Or the small businesses in those irrigation communities that have worked for 40 years to build up a business, to use that as their superannuation, and now it's worthless. Or the young agronomist that wants to have a go. He's had a start in life and he wants to put a second agronomist on, but because of the uncertainty he can't. So he works 16 hours a day, 16 hours a day to make a living, to the point of exhaustion, absolute exhaustion. He rolls his utility. He just about kills himself and leaves his family and his children behind. These are real lives. These are real stories we're talking about. This is about leadership at this moment.
The member for Shorten.
This nation, we need, as leaders, expect us to deliver this plan. If this nation and this parliament has descended into politics over leadership and people, then I pity you and I pity what you become.
The members for Barton and Chifley might figure out in a couple of minutes that they're preventing me calling the member for Franklin. Member for Franklin has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture. In recent months, we've seen the devastating agricultural impacts of fruit fly in Tasmania for the first time ever, coming after the Hodgman government slashed Tasmania's biosecurity budget. Doesn't this outbreak simply confirm that the biosecurity failures of this Conservative government and the Conservative Hodgman government in Tasmania are causing real harm to Tasmania's fruit-growing industry and the thousands of jobs in my state that rely on it?
The Minister for Agriculture has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for her question, although misguided in a lot of its substance. The reality is the Hodgman government, in the outbreak of the fruit fly situation in Tasmania, has announced $2 million to address the situation, putting real money on the ground, doing real things to give delivery, to support the agricultural sector in Tasmania, working with us as a federal government to ensure that we maintain the market access into those markets that are so important to give the real returns to those farmers in Tasmania, to take advantage of the free trade agreements that we've put in place that you're scared of. The reality is we are making real inroads into delivering on biosecurity, to the extent that under the competitive white paper we committed $200 million as a national government to ensure that our responsibilities lived up. I'm proud to say that the Hodgman Liberal government is also undertaking their responsibilities by implementing a $2 million implementation fund to fight fruit flies. That's real action, that's delivery. That's what real governments do. We don't talk about it, we act on it.
The member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Social Services. Will the minister update the House on the action the government is taking to assist welfare recipients with drug, alcohol and gambling addictions? Is the minister aware of any measures to expand these programs, particularly in my electorate of O'Connor?
The Minister for Social Services.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question and note that he has always been a strong advocate for those in his local communities. In September last year, the Prime Minister and the then Minister for Human Services visited the member for O'Connor to speak with communities from the goldfields about the cashless debit card. And can I acknowledge the former Minister for Human Services and the commitment that he has showed to the cashless debit card and getting these trials up and running. These communities told them about their experience with domestic violence. I don't think we should be funny about this. Experience with domestic violence, with alcoholism and with drug abuse. And they met with a councillor from the Coolgardie Shire who recounted her experience about how young children have their futures destroyed when money isn't spent on food, on clothes and on the necessities that they take for granted. She spoke to them on behalf of her community about how they wanted to try the cashless debit card. And after seeing what it had done for others in Ciobo and the East Kimberley, the government is committed, and I'm sure in every way everyone in this parliament is committed to reducing the social harm caused by welfare-fuelled alcohol, drug abuse and gambling in areas with high levels of welfare dependency. We are trying new programs and policies because we want to find a solution, and the welfare card is working. 48% of drug takers using fewer drugs, 41% of those who have alcohol issues drinking less, 48% of gamblers gambling less. While the government appreciates the support that's been provided by the opposition on the continuation of Ciobo and East Kimberley, we call on them to support the expansion of the card to additional communities. As we know, we will see the best results when we all work together on these issues. These trials are working, and we want to roll them out and continue to roll them out, including in the seat of the member for Hinkler. And we ask for the opposition's support in continuing to do these trials, and we do so in a bipartisan manner.
The member for Kingston.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Productivity Commission has confirmed that since this Conservative government came to office, families are paying over $2,000 more a year for childcare. And now this Prime Minister is introducing childcare changes which will leave 279,000 families worse off. Just how much more will these 279,000 families have to pay because the Prime Minister doesn't understand the cost of living pressures facing families?
The Prime Minister has the
honourable member for a question, but the honourable member overlooks the fact that the government's childcare reforms have created additional opportunities for Australian families on lower incomes, on lower and middle incomes, to access childcare. The simple fact of the matter is that over 1 million families are benefiting from our childcare reforms. The Labor Party opposed them. They are means-tested. There are families on high incomes that are no longer getting a benefit, that we have done that to ensure that the help is where it is most needed, and it is ensuring that more Australian families can stay connected to the workforce when their children are small. And, Mr Speaker, you can see that this is all part of our consistent policy to create more jobs and more opportunities. 403,000 jobs in the last year, 75% of them full-time, the highest female participation rate in our history. What we are determined to do is to ensure that more families are able better to manage that work-life balance, manage to be with their children, especially when they're small, stay connected to the workforce and not suffer the consequences of a long absence from the workforce that, as we all know, is tough on both fathers and mothers, but especially tough on mothers. Our childcare reforms are historic, they are equitable, they are generous. The honourable member should be backing them instead of trying to find fault where none exists.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. Will the minister update the House on action the government is taking to strengthen the electricity market and reduce pressure on power prices so that hard-working Australian families and businesses can get ahead? Minister, what are the risks with alternative approaches?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for Boothby for her question, and know that she is focused on delivering lower power prices for households and for businesses across her electorate, including Petriti Wines in Dover Gardens, which is a fourth-generation family-owned business which employs around 30 people, Mr Speaker. And those members on this side of the House from South Australia, including from Barker, including from Sturt, Mr Speaker, and including from Grey, know that in South Australia, because of the faults of the Weatherall government, on average power prices are 20% more than across the rest of the country, Mr Speaker. That is why we have taken action to intervene in the gas market, and the ACCC has reported that prices have come down by up to 50%. That is why we have passed legislation to abolish the limited merits review to stop the gaming of the system by the networks. That is why we've reached a deal with the retailers to get a better deal for millions of Australians on their power bills. That's why we're investing in storage in Snowy 2.0 and Coltana in the Upper Spencer Gulf in South Australia. And that is why we have accepted the recommendation of the independent experts on the National Energy Guarantee, which, compared to the Labor Party's emissions intensity scheme, will see the average Australian household $300 a year better off, Mr Speaker. Now, I'm asked, am I aware of any alternative approaches? Well, I know that the member for Port Adelaide, he's been a bit preoccupied as of late. Been preoccupied, too busy with his backroom buffoonery, Mr Speaker. Too busy with the backroom buffoonery, because he knows that when the Labor Party was last in office, power prices went up 100%, Mr Speaker.
and he knows that the Labor Party is proposing a new tax on electricity, Mr Speaker, with the emissions intensity scheme, and that the Labor Party has a reckless 50% renewable energy target, Mr Speaker, and that the Labor Party is proposing cutting emissions across the economy by 45% but has no plan and no detail. No wonder the Business Council of Australia has called their proposal risky and unnecessary, Mr Speaker. But most of all, the Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party want to take the disaster and the dangerous experiment of South Australia national, Mr Speaker. That is what the Labor Party wants to do. It hasn't learnt about the mistakes of Labor governments in South Australia and now in Victoria. And only the Coalition, with its National Energy Guarantee, with its investments in storage, with its deal with the retailers, with its intervention in the gas markets, can deliver more affordable and reliable power for all Australians.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's answers yesterday about Senator Molan. Is the Prime Minister aware that last year the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom publicly rebuked President Trump for sharing material from the same racist and bigoted group as Senator Molan has shared? If the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom can rebuke the President of the United States for sharing material from Britain First, why can't the Prime Minister of Australia publicly rebuke his most junior backbencher for doing exactly the same thing?
Members on my left. Members on my left. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I suppose we can be pleased that the member for Isaacs did not repeat the scurrilous attacks on Major General Molan that we saw yesterday. The disgraceful attacks on a great Australian soldier who has defended and fought for the values and the freedoms we enjoy in this parliament. Senator Molan has taken down all of those postings. He's closed his Twitter account and taken down all of those postings, and he's made a public statement about it, regretting that he posted them in the first place.
The member for McKellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is...
The member for McKellar can resume his seat. The member for Whitlam can leave his seat and leave the chamber under 94A. The member for McKellar has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Small and Family Businesses, Workplace Relations and Deregulation. Will the minister outline for the House why it is important for employer and employee organisations to always act in the best interests of their members? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Small Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member from McKellar for the question. Mr Speaker, it is vital that employer and employee organisations always act in the best interests of their members, and that is exactly why the Turnbull Coalition government established the Registered Organisations Commission. And why is it needed? Just this week, we have learnt that George Clark, who was the New South Wales State President of the Transport Workers Union, the TWU, has resigned in protest. But, Mr Speaker, not only has he resigned in protest, he has given an insight into exactly the reasons why this commission was necessary. On his way out the door, he's let loose with a grape spray. He has come out publicly and blown the whistle on the expenditure of members' money by the management of the TWU. He has said that the New South Wales TWU State Secretary, Mr Richard Olsen, has spent members' money in a list of ways, and some of them are as follows: thousands of members' dollars on long lunches, thousands of members' dollars on overseas trips for officials, thousands of members' dollars, and I don't understand this one, on black vinyl lounges, but at least it wasn't leather, so he was probably saving the members some money. Thousands of dollars on legal fees and thousands of dollars on political donations, including donations to the member for Greenway's campaign, which were not properly authorised. It's all sounding very familiar, isn't it? But this part's not familiar. What has Mr Olsen done? Mr Clark has broken the silence. He's quit in disgust, and he said himself, "We are a robust union, but there are guys treating it like it's their union, not members' money." And to add insult to injury, I don't believe the gall of Mr Olsen. The TWU are planning a new $2 million headquarters. And what's Mr Olsen going to do after spending all of the members' money? He's been there 16 months, Mr Speaker, and he's going to name the building after himself. It is going to be Richard Olsen House. You cannot make this stuff up. Richard Olsen House, the new state premises for the New South Wales Transport Workers Union. Mr Speaker, the sad part is, while I've taken the mickey out of this stuff actually goes on. It's exactly why we established the Registered Organisations Commission, and exactly why we passed legislation that through this place about corrupting benefits, because union members pay their membership fees in good faith, and union officials should act in good faith as well. And if they don't, they should bloody well be held to account.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed in the notice paper.
I thank the Prime